Juliet sat quietly in the corner of their small living room, her gaze fixed on the floor as her mother's voice echoed through the house. It had been a few months since her father passed away, but her mother still hadn't adjusted. The weight of his absence had created a tension that seemed to hang in the air at all times. Juliet could feel it in every glance her mother threw at her, every sharp word that followed, every sigh of disappointment that seemed to come her way. "Look at the other girls in this street," her mother would often shout. "They bring money home for their families. They bring things for their mothers. But what about you? You're just sitting there wasting time. Useless. You're good for nothing." Juliet's heart would sink at these words, but she would say nothing. She was used to them now. It was always the same. Other girls in the neighborhood seemed to have it all figured out. Money, new clothes, expensive phones, and luxury items. Every time Juliet saw them walking around, holding their heads high with smiles on their faces, she couldn't help but wonder how they did it. How did they get so much? Her mother, on the other hand, expected Juliet to bring home the same kind of things. Juliet was only 15 years old, but her mother had already placed the burden of taking care of the family on her shoulders. Juliet couldn't even remember the last time her mother worked. Ever since her father passed, it seemed like she had completely given up on trying to make a living. It was as though she believed it was Juliet's job to take care of them both now. Juliet's father had been a kind man, a hard worker who had always made sure they had what they needed. But when he died, things changed. The money stopped coming in, and the once peaceful home became a place filled with tension and uncertainty. Juliet's mother became bitter, angry at the world for taking her husband, angry at Juliet for not stepping up like the other girls in their neighborhood. Every day, her mother would remind Juliet of how much easier life would be if she just found a way to bring money home. It was like a constant soundtrack to her life. "The other girls are making money. Why can't you be like them? You're no good to me if you don't start bringing something home." Juliet had always hated these comparisons. She didn't want to be like the other girls. She didn't want to sell herself for money, no matter how much it seemed to promise. But as the months passed, the pressure from her mother grew stronger, and Juliet began to feel trapped. She didn't know what else to do. She didn't want to let her mother down, but the more her mother demanded, the more she started to believe that maybe there was no other way. Juliet began to feel the weight of the world pressing down on her young shoulders, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it up. One evening, after a particularly harsh argument with her mother, Juliet sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. Her mother had just told her she was worthless, just like her father had said before he died. "Why don't you help your mother? I can't keep doing this alone. Go and get something. Anything." Juliet looked at herself and shook her head. She didn't want to be like the other girls. She didn't want to walk the same dark path they had. But as the days wore on and the pressure grew unbearable, she began to wonder if there was any other way. Her mother would never change. Juliet could see that now. She would always demand more, always expect Juliet to carry the weight of the family. And Juliet was just a child. A 15-year-old girl who shouldn't have to carry the burden of her mother's expectations. But as time went by, it became harder to refuse. Juliet could see her mother's frustration building, and she couldn't stand the thought of letting her down. Then, one evening, something happened that would change everything. Juliet was walking home from school, her mind heavy with thoughts of the argument she'd had with her mother earlier that day. As she walked through the street, she saw the familiar faces of the other girls. They were laughing, holding bags filled with expensive items. New phones, shoes, jewelry. Their faces were glowing, their eyes filled with pride. One of the girls, Amara, called out to Juliet. "Hey, Juliet! Why are you walking alone? Don't you want to make some money? You know you could join us, right? It's not that hard, you know. And it's fast." Juliet felt a wave of disgust, but she didn't know how to respond. She couldn't say no. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was just like the other girls. She was starting to cave under the pressure. The temptation to take the easy way out was growing stronger every day. "Think about it," Amara said. her voice soft but persuasive. Money. Good things. Better life. It's waiting for you. For the first time, Juliet hesitated. Could she really do this? Could she follow the same path as the others? She didn't know how much longer she could say no. That night, after Amara's words lingered in her mind, Juliet sat on her bed, her thoughts racing. The offer seemed too tempting to ignore. Money. Love. Freedom. All of it could be hers with just a few simple steps. She had seen the way the other girls walked around like queens, the way they commanded attention, the way their lives seemed to be easy and filled with joy. It was hard not to wonder what it would feel like to have that kind of life. A life without constant struggle. A life that didn't require carrying the burden of her mother's unspoken expectations. The next morning when Juliet woke up, the decision had been made. She had tried to ignore it, to push the thoughts aside, but now they felt like a part of her. She could no longer deny what she had to do. She couldn't keep disappointing her mother. Juliet, her mother shouted from the kitchen, snapping her out of her thoughts. Why are you still in bed? Don't you want to help me around here? Or are you just going to keep being lazy like your father? Juliet didn't respond. She just got up, quickly washed her face and got dressed. There was no point in arguing. Her mother's words stung, but they no longer had the same effect on her. She was becoming numb to the criticism, numb to the pressure. As she walked out of the house and made her way down the street, she found herself looking for Amara. It didn't take long before she spotted her, standing in front of the old convenience store, chatting with the other girls. "Hey Juliet," Amara called out when she saw her approaching. "You finally ready?" Juliet hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded. "Yes." Amara grinned. "Good. Come on, let's go." The girls led Juliet to a dark corner of the neighborhood, a place she had never been before. It was quiet, almost eerie, and Juliet felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to turn around to run back home, but something inside her held her in place. She felt like she had crossed a line that she could never uncross. They led her to a building with no windows, just a small door at the side. Amara knocked 3 times, and the door creaked open. Inside was dimly lit, with a strange smell hanging in the air. It felt wrong, but Juliet didn't know how to back out now. She had already made the decision. There was no turning back. The inside was like nothing Juliet had ever seen before. The walls were covered in strange paintings, and the furniture looked expensive, but old, like it had been passed down through generations. A man in his 30s sat at a table, his eyes narrowing when he saw Juliet. "This is her?" he asked, his voice deep and rough. "Yeah," Amara replied. "She's ready to start." Juliet swallowed, her heart racing. She didn't know what to expect, but she was already feeling out of place. The man looked her up and down, then nodded. "All right, sit down," he said. Juliet did as she was told, but every part of her felt uneasy. The man started talking to her about the business and what she would need to do. It was the same thing the other girls had told her before. How to behave, how to dress, and how to act. It sounded simple enough, but there was something about his voice that made it all seem so wrong. By the end of the meeting, she was handed a stack of cash. It felt like a weight in her hands, the money so much more than she had ever seen before. It wasn't just money, it was power. And Juliet couldn't deny that a part of her felt a strange thrill as she clutched it tightly. She left the building that night feeling like a different person. Her mind was spinning, her emotions all over the place. She had done it. She had crossed the line. And now there was no going back. The next few days were a blur. Juliet became a part of the system, just like the other girls. She wore the clothes they wore, went to the places they went, and met the men they met. At first it was awkward, but as time passed it became easier. The money kept coming, and with it, the things her mother had always wanted. Expensive gifts, new clothes, and jewelry. Juliet could see the way her mother's attitude changed. She no longer shouted at Juliet. Now she just smiled like everything was perfect. But deep down, Juliet knew it wasn't. It was a lie. A dangerous lie that she had convinced herself to believe. Every night after returning home, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling empty inside. She wasn't happy. She wasn't proud of what she was doing, but the pressure to keep going kept pushing her forward. She couldn't stop now, not when her mother was depending on her. Not when the money seemed to solve all of their problems. Then one day Juliet met Lucas. At first, Juliet was drawn to Lucas in a way she couldn't explain. He had the kind of confidence that made people listen when he spoke, the kind of presence that made him stand out in any room. His expensive clothes, flashy car, and suave charm were like a magnet that pulled her closer. He told her everything she wanted to hear. How beautiful she was, how special she was, how he could give her the life she dreamed of. Unlike the other men, Lucas didn't rush or make her feel cheap. He treated her like a queen, and for the first time in a long while, Juliet felt like she mattered. But something about him felt off. Every time their eyes met, there was an intensity in his gaze that sent a chill down her spine. His smile never reached his eyes, and the way he spoke, slow and deliberate, made Juliet feel like she was walking into something she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't long before Juliet started to spend more and more time with Lucas. He took her to fancy restaurants, showed her expensive places, and bought her gifts that made her feel like she was part of a world she could never have imagined. But despite the luxury and the attention, there was an underlying unease she couldn't shake. She started to notice things that didn't add up. The way Lucas was always surrounded by people who looked at him with fear rather than admiration, the way people whispered his name behind his back. One evening, as they were sitting at a cafe, Lucas casually mentioned something about Agatha, one of the other girls in the neighborhood. Juliet had seen Agatha around, but she never really spoke to her. She was older than Juliet, maybe in her 20s, and she seemed to have it all together, like she was in control of her life. But one day she suddenly disappeared. No one seemed to know where she went, and whispers began to spread that she had been taken care of by someone powerful. "Have you heard about Agatha?" Lucas asked, his voice calm, but there was a strange edge to it. Juliet looked up from her drink, trying to mask the unease building inside her. "What do you mean?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You don't know. She's gone. Vanished just like that. The thing is, no one really knows what happened to her. But I do." Juliet's stomach turned as she listened. She didn't want to know more. She already had an uncomfortable feeling about Lucas, but this was different. The way he spoke made it sound like Agatha's disappearance wasn't random, but something planned. "She was used," Lucas continued, his eyes gleaming with a hint of something darker. "You see, not everyone is willing to do what it takes to get to the top. But Agatha, well, she didn't hesitate." Juliet's mind raced, and a sense of dread washed over her. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she had a bad feeling about it. She knew better than to ask too many questions. The more she heard, the more she realized that Lucas was not just another wealthy man. He was involved in something far darker, and Juliet was slowly being pulled into it. Weeks passed, and Juliet's suspicions grew. The more time she spent with Lucas, the more things didn't add up. He always seemed to have money, always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, but there was no explanation for it. He never talked about his work, his business, only about the things he could give her, the things they could do together. But there was an eerie quality to the life Lucas promised. There were moments when he would disappear for days at a time, leaving Juliet to wonder what he was really doing. Each time he returned, he would speak of new opportunities, new ways to make money, new ways to rise above everyone else. But Juliet couldn't ignore the feeling that these opportunities weren't as innocent as he made them seem. It wasn't until one night, when she visited Lucas unexpectedly, that the full truth started to emerge. Juliet had gone to his place to surprise him, but when she arrived, she was greeted with an unsettling silence. His apartment was dark, the only light coming from a faint glow under the door to his study. She hesitated but then pushed the door open, thinking he was just busy with work. What she saw inside made her heart stop. The room was dimly lit by candles, and in the center of the room was a large altar. Strange symbols were painted on the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of incense. But it wasn't the room itself that froze Juliet in place. It was the woman lying on the altar. It was Agatha. She was unconscious, her body thin and pale, her mouth open as if she had been screaming. But no sound came from her. A man, wearing a dark hood and robe, was standing beside the altar, chanting in a language Juliet didn't recognize. Lucas was standing off to the side, watching, his face expressionless. His eyes locked with Juliet's, and for the first time, she saw something truly terrifying in his gaze. It was as if he had been expecting her all along. "Lucas!" Juliet gasped, her voice shaking. "What is this? What have you done to her?" Lucas didn't move. He didn't even blink. "This," he said slowly, "is how the world works. You think money just falls from the sky. Well, take something more. It takes sacrifice." Juliet couldn't breathe. Her legs felt like jelly, her mind racing with terror. She had just stumbled upon something so dark, so evil, that she could hardly comprehend it. She backed away from the door, every instinct telling her to run, to get as far away from Lucas and the mysterious ritual as possible. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her thoughts screamed for escape. But Lucas wasn't finished with her yet. As she turned to flee, his cold voice stopped her in her tracks. "You can't leave, Juliet. Not yet." She froze, her body trembling with fear, as his words cut through her like a blade. Lucas slowly stepped toward her, his face still as unreadable as before. There was something cold and calculating in his eyes, a darkness that she had only glimpsed moments ago but now saw all too clearly. "I saw you watching," Lucas continued, his voice calm, almost soothing, as though nothing was wrong. "You need to understand. This is how it works. This is the way things are meant to be." Juliet couldn't stop the tears that welled up in her eyes. "What is this? What are you doing to her?" She gestured toward Agatha's still, lifeless form on the altar. You used her for this. For money. For power." Lucas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to the altar, his eyes lingering on Agatha's pale face. He ran his fingers along the edge of the altar, almost reverently. "It's not just about money, Juliet," he said quietly. "It's about control. Power. The kind of power that can make you untouchable. The kind of power that changes everything." Juliet couldn't understand. She had known something was off about Lucas, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. She had always thought that the girls who did these things were victims of circumstance, maybe a little misguided, but she never thought it could be this brutal, this twisted. She had been naive to think Lucas was just another rich guy with an interest in her. Now she knew the truth. Lucas wasn't just about luxury and money. He was dangerous, and he had something far more sinister planned for her. As the realization hit her, the room seemed to close in. The walls felt like they were pressing in on her, suffocating her. But it wasn't just Lucas she had to fear. It was her own mother. "You think this is bad?" Lucas's voice broke into her thoughts, dragging her back to the present. "You haven't seen anything yet." Juliet looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Lucas smirked, his eyes narrowing. "You're not just here because I want you, Juliet. You're here because your mother sent you to me." The words hit Juliet like a punch to the gut. Her mind spun. "No. My mother didn't." But Lucas raised a hand, silencing her. "Oh yes, she did. You see, your mother came to me a few weeks ago. She knows exactly what's going on. She wanted this for you. She wanted you to be my next sacrifice." Juliet's head spun. It was as if the world around her had tilted, and she couldn't make sense of it. Her mother. The woman who had raised her, the woman who had told her that she was useless, that she needed to do something with her life. The same woman who had demanded money from her, who had pressured her every day, had sent her into this nightmare. The realization tore through Juliet like a storm. Her own mother had planned for her to be the next victim in Lucas's sick ritual. She had known all along that something wasn't right. But now, she understood just how far her mother was willing to go to escape her own misery. She had chosen the most vulnerable person, her daughter. Your mother is desperate, Juliet, Lucas continued, his voice smooth and cold. She wants money, power. She's willing to do anything to get it. She sent you to me because she knew what would happen. She knew I could give her what she wanted. Juliet felt her legs go weak, and she had to steady herself on the edge of the table. Oh, she wouldn't. She couldn't. But Lucas's eyes told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't lying. He wasn't even playing games. The pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place, and Juliet realized just how deep her mother's betrayal ran. Her own mother had sold her out. Had sold her for money. For power. Tears streamed down Juliet's face as she backed away from Lucas, her hands trembling. I can't believe this. I can't believe she would do this to me. Lucas's face remained cold, as though he felt nothing for her pain. You think you're the only one who's been used. You think Agatha didn't know what she was getting into? The world is a dark place, Juliet. People like your mother make choices every day that take them farther from the light. And now you're part of that world. You can't get out. Not unless you do what's required. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as Juliet's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't stay in this dark place a second longer. Lucas had made it clear that there was no escape unless she did what he wanted, unless she agreed to be part of his twisted rituals. But Juliet wasn't going to give up so easily. She refused to let her mother's betrayal define her life. Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning faster than she could process them. She needed to escape. But how? Then her gaze landed on something that made her heart stop, a small, sharp object lying on the table. It was a letter opener, just lying there, almost as if it had been waiting for her. She didn't hesitate. With trembling hands, she grabbed it, her fingers curling tightly around the handle. Lucas, she said, her voice shaking but determined. I don't care what you want. I won't be a part of this. I won't let you control me, and I won't let my mother use me. Lucas's gaze turned cold, his lips curling into a smile that sent chills down Juliet's spine. You're too late, he said softly. You're already in this. Your mother wanted it, and now it's happening. There's no going back. But Juliet wasn't afraid. She was angry. Angry at Lucas for trying to use her, and even angrier at her mother for sending her into this nightmare. She refused to be another victim. With every ounce of strength she had, Juliet turned and ran for the door. Lucas lunged after her, but Juliet was faster. She had to get out. She had to survive. The apartment was on the second floor, but Juliet didn't care. She didn't stop to think. She didn't stop to calculate the risk. She just ran. She bolted down the hallway, pushing past the shadows that seemed to stretch out toward her. When she reached the stairs, she didn't hesitate. She leapt down 2 steps at a time, her heart racing as she heard Lucas's voice echoing behind her. He was close. Too close. But Juliet didn't stop. She burst through the front door into the cold night air. The street was empty, but the darkness pressed in on her from all sides. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she couldn't go back home. Not yet. Not after everything she had discovered. The further she ran, the clearer her mind became. She needed help. She needed to find someone she could trust. And there was only one person who could help her now. Amara. Amara had always been a part of this world, but she was also the one who had welcomed Juliet into it. Maybe, just maybe, she would be able to help Juliet now. With every step, Juliet's resolve grew stronger. She wasn't going to let this be her life. She wasn't going to let Lucas or her mother control her anymore. She wasn't going to be used or manipulated. She would fight back. After what felt like hours, Juliet finally reached Amara's house. She knocked frantically on the door, praying that Amara would be home. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and Amara's face appeared in the doorway, surprised to see her. Juliet, what's going on? Why are you? Amara's eyes widened as she saw the fear in Juliet's face. What happened? Without thinking, Juliet burst into tears, the weight of everything she had learned crashing down on her all at once. "It's Lucas," she sobbed. "And my mother. They're using me for a ritual. My mother sent me to him. She wants money. She wants power." Amara's face turned pale, her eyes widening with shock and disbelief. "No. That can't be true. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure?" Juliet nodded, her voice trembling. "I saw it. I saw everything. He was going to use me just like Agatha. Can't go back there. I can't let them do this to me." Amara stepped back, pulling Juliet into the safety of her home. "We need to get to the police. We need to tell them everything." Juliet shook her head. "I can't. They'll never believe me. They'll think I'm just another girl caught up in this mess. No one will help me." But Amara's face hardened with determination. "We have to try, Juliet. We have to make them believe us. We can't let him get away with it." The two girls spent hours talking, trying to come up with a plan, but the fear and uncertainty still clung to Juliet like a heavy weight. She couldn't believe what her mother had done to her. The woman who had raised her, who had told her every day how much she meant to her, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. But in the end, Juliet knew one thing for sure. She had to be strong. She had to take control of her life again. The next day, with Amara's help, Juliet went to the police. It wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. But eventually the truth came out. They uncovered Lucas's dark secrets, and the truth about the ritualistic sacrifices was revealed. Agatha's disappearance was just the beginning, and now the entire network was exposed. But the biggest shock of all came when Juliet's mother was arrested. It turned out that she had been involved in more than just sending Juliet to Lucas. She had been part of the entire operation, using her own daughter for money, for power, for a better life. The shock was too much for Juliet to process. The woman she had loved, the woman who had once been her protector, had turned into her betrayer. In the aftermath, Juliet faced a long journey of healing. She had to learn how to trust again, how to live a life free from the suffocating pressure of her mother's demands. But through it all, she found strength in herself, in her own courage to escape and fight back. She was her own person now, and nothing could take that away.